The lighthouse log described 2 days of catastrophic storm that drove experienced men to prayer and tears. But the final entry was written in a calm hand, and the pen had been cleaned and put away. Whatever happened next was swift enough to stop 11 days of entries, but orderly enough to let one man finish his last sentence. What the log said. Part 2 of 4. Robert Muirhead did not immediately dismiss the log. He studied it carefully, because it was the only record left by the 3 missing men. Every entry up to the final page was written in the precise, professional manner expected of Northern Lighthouse Board keepers. The log entries were not personal diaries. They were official documents required by board regulations to record weather conditions, lamp status, supply levels, and any unusual observations. Lighthouse keepers understood that every entry they made was an official record. They did not write casually or imprecisely. What Muirhead found in Marshall's final entries was therefore deeply at odds with what he knew about the character of the men who had written them. The entry for December 13 described a severe storm beginning to build. Marshall wrote that the storm was the worst he had ever seen in 20 years of service. He wrote that the seas were mountainous. He recorded that all 3 men had spent hours in prayer. He noted that Duquette had been silent throughout the day. In 20 years of professional lighthouse keeping, Thomas Marshall had never before recorded that he or any colleague had spent a day in prayer. This detail was noted specifically in Muirhead's official report. The entry for December 14 was written by Marshall and continued in the same extraordinary vein. He wrote that the storm was still raging. He recorded that MacArthur had been crying. He wrote that Duquette had continued to be silent. Again, no lighthouse log in the Northern Lighthouse Board records had ever before contained an entry stating that a keeper was crying. Muirhead noted this as a second unprecedented detail in the official log. He described it in his report as behavior entirely inconsistent with the men's known characters and professional history. The entry for December 15 was the last. It was written in a different tone from the previous 2. Marshall recorded that the storm had ceased. He wrote that the sea was calm. He wrote that God was over all. And then the log ended. There were no further entries, no entry for December 16, no entry for December 17, nothing. The pen had been cleaned and replaced. The inkwell was capped. The logbook had been closed and set in its proper place on the shelf. Whatever had happened to the 3 men, it had not been sudden enough to prevent the final log entry from being completed neatly. But it had been sudden enough that no one had made another entry for the following 11 days until Moore arrived and found the station empty. Now here is the detail that Muirhead could not reconcile. If the storm described in the log had ended on December 15, and the men had survived it, then they should have still been alive on December 15 at the moment the final entry was made. But the lamp had not been lit on any of those nights. The light had gone dark. Merchant vessels and fishing boats operating in the area confirmed after the fact that they had not seen the Flannan Isles light burning during the period between mid-December and the arrival of the Hesperus. One vessel's log recorded passing the area on December 17 and noting the light's absence. The crew had assumed the lamp mechanism had failed. The light's absence on December 17 meant that whoever had written the final calm entry on December 15 had been gone, or incapacitated, by nightfall on December 15 at the absolute latest. This was the core of the impossibility Muirhead faced. Muirhead proposed the most logical explanation available, that a rogue wave, or series of waves, had struck the western landing where the displaced rope, the bent railing, and the moved stone block had been found, and had swept the men into the sea. This explanation accounted for the physical damage at the western landing. It accounted for the absence of bodies. It did not account for why all 3 men had gone to the western landing simultaneously, in violation of standard lighthouse protocol, which strictly required that at least one keeper remain inside the lighthouse at all times. It did not account for the storm log entries that preceded a weather record showing calm conditions. And it did not account for one further detail that Muirhead included in his report almost as an aside, one sentence that he did not attempt to explain. The oilskin waterproof coats belonging to all three men were still hanging on their hooks inside the lighthouse. If the men had gone to the western landing during or after a storm, they would have worn their oilskins. They had not. All three oilskin coats were hanging dry inside the lighthouse. Men who had spent their careers on the North Atlantic would never have stepped outside toward a dangerous cliff landing without them. Not in December, not in any weather. That's it for part 2. Follow Untold Lores for part 3, like and subscribe for daily stories.